All right, thank you everybody for being here. This is our third look at the symbols that have come to us from our understanding of our faith concerning the crucifixion and the passion of Christ. Remember last week we looked at how our understanding of the cross developed over time, the crucifix and the resurrection styles of cross, and the way people begin to incorporate them into many different forms. This time we're going to look at what happens when a faith meets a new culture and a new way of understanding things. Part of what we understand to be the spread of the church was the conquest of nations like Spain and Portugal and England. This happens to be a map of the Spanish Empire that included both Spain itself and North Africa and South America and North America, because a lot of this country was Spanish to begin with. And the way they did it was that people like Columbus and all of the other early explorers got their financial backing from some empire. But they also made sure that they had the backing of the papacy so that they could have an excuse of conquering by saying, this is the will of God, this is the work of God, that we go and save these people from their paganism and bring them into the church. The Royal Spanish charge to Cristobal Colon was issued in Granada in 1492, obviously, and he was charged by God's help to discover and subdue islands and continents on the king's behalf. And then the following year, Pope Alexander issued the encyclical Inter Caetera, which through their Catholic majesties of Spain, allowed Catholicism to be introduced into the New World. So that's how that worked. And the same thing happened with the British crown and the emperors in all of the other conquering countries. They made sure that in order to keep themselves from being sinners and invaders and persecutors, they were defenders of the faith. Now, when worlds interact like that, it is never comfortable and it never works very well. This is the Colonial Cathedral in Mexico City. This is the Kukulkan installation in Chichen Itza, which is near Tulum, Mexico, in the Yucatan. This is European. This is not. I mean, this is a bird sculpture and a step pyramid. And there's no affinity there in the way the faith is expressed, because there was no affinity in the faiths being practiced. But this, even though it looked out of place then, and still to some degree looks out of place now, what they were doing was establishing their identity in the New World in order to connect wealth and power to that identity. They couldn't be the rich and the powerful of Europe, but they could build things that looked like it, and they could build the sort of caste systems that colonialism built to make it look like it. And that was pretty much the history of colonialism. It was a kind of a competition between these two. This was so under-protected and this so overwhelming that this eventually became what religion looked like in the New World. And then in the middle of the last century, the Vatican determined that it was in error, not so much in spreading the faith, but perhaps in the way they practiced it, in the methods that they used. And one of the things that came out of the Second Vatican Council was finally the understanding that there were more poor Catholics than rich ones. And so it was the duty of the church to begin to defend the poor. That hit the New World, especially Latin America, which was dreadfully poor because their cultures had been destroyed by colonialism. So that really hit there. And the other element of that story was that the biggest teaching order and the biggest imperial pontifical order going into the southern part of the Western Hemisphere were the Jesuits. The Jesuits are a teaching order. They really like to proclaim the gospel. And they started proclaiming the gospel in the slums, the barrios, the places where people needed help the most. Then, when Vatican II came along, the church said, this is the right thing to do. Whenever we do something as an institution, we must exercise within it a preferential option for the poor. Not saying that there was anything wrong with being rich, but don't forget the poor. To make that visible, to bring that into the range of symbol, people started looking in Scripture, and instead of seeing Christ on the cross or seeing the Lamb enthroned or seeing any of the powerful figures of the Trinity, what they started to read were the stories like this that John August Swanson painted: Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, Jesus the servant, Jesus the one who not only gave his life, conquered death, did all those things, but the one who loved his neighbor better than anybody else. That became the new understanding of Jesus. Out of that came what is now known as liberation theology. And it's fascinating, and if we had another hour, we'd do a whole inquiry into liberation theology, because it is the most modern of all of the ones that have really become established. The one that is now establishing is environmental theology. But you had to learn how to liberate the people first before you could liberate the land and everything, and the animals and everything else. So out of that comes this notion that Jesus is not just the King of heaven and the hope for the future. He is the good neighbor. He is Christ the servant, as well as Christ the King. Out of that comes stuff like this. This is from John's and my collection. This is a jaguar warrior, a very common symbol in history of indigenous peoples of Mexico. You see his jaguar eyes up there. But in the indigenous people's version, you would not see all these little symbols on him. That comes with Catholicism. The jaguar warrior, his spirit was understood and powerful. What these little emblems, these little symbolic pieces, are called milagros. People learned to pray by giving offerings in indigenous cultures. Now they, through their Catholic understanding, were learning to pray a new way. Each one of these milagros is a prayer that asks some kind of communion with God. Sometimes it's, heal my sick kid, or sometimes it's help me find work. Sometimes it is something else. It's gratitude. In the detail over here, that's a milagro. It is Christ with the crown of thorns. Christ the servant now has become the vehicle for prayer in these indigenous communities. And this kind of fusion starts up all over the place and all around the world. This is another one of our pieces. The El Señor de Ráquira, he is a little indigenous man wearing the dress of the people of the high Andes. He is Jesus on the cross, but Jesus as a campesino, a Jesus who looks like me, for those people who are learning now to understand who God is and how they can belong to God and how they can understand God. Their culture has accepted these symbols, and now they're making the symbols their own. And that's what you see with him. Liberation theology said, love your neighbor as yourself. That was a primary thing. The second thing was the preferential option for the poor. But there was another part of it too that said, if you are going to be a follower of Jesus the servant, then you must seek social justice. You must not only consider your own sins, you must consider the sins that make people abuse people, that make the rich and powerful forget the poor, that make the poor so angry that they rise up against the rich and powerful. This was the kind of thing that is floating around now in the minds of people as they start to figure out how they're going to express this fusion faith. And this is one of the earliest forms of it. He is absolutely, you can see, in fact, if you look at the sculpture where the nails were, you can see in his face suffering. But that suffering now has taken a position in that society. And the position in that society is telling everyone that suffering is universal. The rich and the powerful suffer from their sins. The poor suffer for their sins. We all are the ones who suffer because we all are the ones who sin. It was real easy for indigenous people to see the European paintings that were in the cathedrals and look at them and learn the messages that they were being told about, but it made no connection with them. This makes the connection. This is where people really begin to own their faith. And when they start talking about the Passion, this kind of thing becomes common. Who's the painter that put all the guys on one side of the table? It was Leonardo. Yeah, it was a European artist. This is somebody who went into one of those cathedrals and saw something similar, or a copy of Leonardo or whatever it was, saw Jesus and the disciples at the Last Supper and said, okay, we too are disciples. The disciples who were in the Leonardo painting, yeah, that's fine. They're for the people who look like Leonardo. This is the Last Supper when people look like us. And each one of these is really interesting because each one of these faces is very much individualized. And so these are 12 different people at this Last Supper. All of them are Andean. All of them are clearly connecting with Jesus. They're all looking at him. So he's the focus of their attention as well as ours. But it is also very much an expression of that culture finding itself in the Christian world. Now I'm going to show you a couple of other things that are not specifically about Easter, but they are fusion examples of how this happens. This is also one in our collection, Holy Family. But the Holy Family of Peru, probably, in the way these people are dressed. The baby is swaddled in the clothing that would swaddle an average baby in Peru. They are dressed accordingly. What's interesting about them is that they have very specific faces. These are real people. These aren't angels, you know, where you get up to the face and all you see is a bunch of blinding light. No, these are real folks. They are poor, they are struggling, but they are sincere in their faith. And they want that known. And this kind of nativity becomes very, very common across all of the New World. And to some degree in Asia, but not nearly as much. I think that the iconography that the Spaniards had instituted was so specific that it was easier to connect to. The British tended to send pictures of the royal families rather than angels. So that's what you see in the cultures that they conquered. And then this final one, this one is not South American. This is North American, and it is Native American. This artist is actually still alive, and he sells through some galleries in Arizona. Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, the Christ Child. No ox and donkey. Migratory people didn't keep oxen and donkeys, but they kept bears and buffaloes, because those were the animals whose spirit they understood and who were images of power, who are now kneeling before the infant king. And you see lots of varieties of this. We also have some talking dolls, some storyteller dolls they sing the oral history of tribes down through the ages. And one of the most interesting ones I've seen lately is a specifically European Santa Claus in a red suit being a storyteller, singing his song. And a lot of that, you see, that's more tourist art, but